Long before supermarkets and microwaves, Native American families mastered cooking tricks we were never meant to forget. What timeless wisdom did we leave behind? And is it already too late to bring it back? Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself. And if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Clay pot slow cooking was not just a recipe. It was a way of pulling flavor out of the earth itself. Native American communities would form thick-walled pots from river clay, baking them slowly in open fires until they were strong enough to hold the richest stews and slow-roasted meats you can imagine. The secret was patience. Cooking meat in these pots over smoldering coals allowed the juices to stay trapped inside, cycling through the dish again and again, infusing every bite with pure, concentrated flavor. No fancy Dutch oven, no stainless steel miracle cookware. Just ancient craftsmanship and a bond with nature so strong you could taste it. The slow, even heat of a clay pot gave even the toughest cuts of meat a tenderness you would not believe unless you had tried it. In a world before timers and thermostats, this was real mastery. And the taste? It was as close to magic as food can get. But clay was not the only tool they used to summon incredible flavors. Sometimes, the real secret was hidden in something even lighter than air, something that grew tall all around them: corn husks. The trick of smoking corn husks for deep, sweet flavor might sound simple today, but it was revolutionary in the world of ancient cooking. Corn was life to many native communities, not just a crop, but a living gift. Every part of it was precious, especially the husks. By soaking them lightly and laying them over hot coals or wrapping food inside them, cooks could infuse whatever they were making with a smoky, sweet richness that no wood or spice could ever truly replace. Smoking corn husks became a way to turn plain dishes into something sacred, layering that faint sweetness into meats, vegetables, even simple bread. It was an invisible ingredient, a secret handshake between the land and the plate. Today, a few high-end restaurants still use this trick, usually without telling you, because the result feels so natural, so impossibly rich, that diners are left wondering what kind of sorcery they have just eaten. But corn was not the only plant they turned to for hidden flavor and power. If you knew where to look, even the tallest pine trees offered a secret recipe for survival. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine, it was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Ash baking was one of the most brilliant and humbling ways Native American cooks created bread without any tools, fancy ovens, or even a proper surface. When you needed to eat, you did not wait for the perfect setup. You dug into the earth itself. Dough was shaped into rough rounds and placed directly onto a bed of hot ashes and embers, then gently covered with more hot ash. The bread would cook slowly, surrounded by a blanket of heat, becoming crusty on the outside and pillowy soft on the inside. If a little ash clung to it, so be it. You brushed it off and bit into a smoky, earthy flavor that modern kitchens would pay fortunes to recreate. It was cooking stripped down to its raw, purest form, food born right from fire and earth. Today, ash-baked bread might seem primitive, but taste one bite of it, and you will understand exactly why this method lasted for centuries. And if you thought bread from ash was wild, wait until you hear how native chefs used cactus to transform even the toughest, most stubborn pieces of meat into buttery, tender feasts. Cactus as a natural tenderizer sounds almost too strange to believe, but it was an everyday trick in many native kitchens. Certain varieties, like prickly pear, are packed with natural enzymes that break down tough muscle fibers in meat. By rubbing raw cactus slices over a piece of game meat, or even marinating it in cactus juice, they could turn chewy, sinewy cuts into tender, flavorful meals that needed almost no extra cooking. It was pure kitchen magic, pulled straight from the harshest landscapes. In places where hunting was hard and every scrap of meat mattered, this trick was not just clever, it was survival. No waste, no frustration, just another example of how nature handed over its secrets to those who knew how to listen. The best part is that cactus does not mask the flavor of the meat. It simply softens it, letting the real richness shine through. Even today, modern chefs have started waking up to this forgotten genius. But it was not just fresh meals that mattered. When you needed to carry food across miles of wilderness, you needed another skill altogether: the incredible art of sun-drying meats under the open sky. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Sweetening with birch bark was one of the most ingenious and almost completely forgotten cooking secrets passed down through native traditions. Long before refined sugar ever touched American soil, Native American cooks knew that certain birch trees contained a natural, subtle sweetness hidden within their sap and inner bark. By carefully harvesting thin strips and boiling them down, they created a lightly sweet syrup or infusion that could flavor drinks, breads, and even savory dishes without overwhelming them. It was a sweetness that whispered rather than shouted, blending seamlessly with the smoky, rich flavors of open-fire cooking. Even today, a few remote communities and experimental chefs are bringing birch syrup back to the table, rediscovering a depth of flavor that supermarket sugar can never hope to match. But when it came to cooking full meals without pots or pans, there was one natural vessel that changed everything: giant pumpkins, hollowed out and transformed into Earth's own slow cookers. Using pumpkin shells as nature's crockpots was one of the most visually stunning and practical techniques Native American cooks ever invented. Imagine carving out a big, sturdy pumpkin, filling it with a mixture of meats, roots, grains, and herbs, and setting it carefully near a low, steady fire. The thick pumpkin walls would slowly roast from the outside while the food inside simmered gently, absorbing all the sweet, nutty flavors of the squash itself. The pumpkin became pot, oven, and seasoning all in one, with no waste and no need for heavy metal tools. When the meal was ready, you simply cut into the tender pumpkin itself and ate it alongside the hearty stew it had helped create. It was a way of turning even the simplest gathering into a feast. And if you thought cooking in pumpkins was impressive, just wait until you see how native cooks used nothing but green leaves and open steam to create fish dishes that tasted like a gift straight from the earth itself. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating Riverstones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. Turning Riverstones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. Burying food underground for natural refrigeration was one of the quiet genius moves that let Native American families survive through blistering summers and brutal winters alike. It sounds almost too simple now, but when done right, it was remarkably effective. By digging deep, shaded pits and lining them with grass, bark, or even cool stones, they created natural refrigerators that could keep vegetables crisp, fruits fresh, and even meat safer than leaving it above ground. There was an art to it, a dance with the seasons and the soil that few today remember. But the wisdom of making the earth itself your storage partner never truly faded. And when long journeys or harsh winters loomed ahead, native chefs had another brilliant solution for keeping their people nourished on the move, mixing wild berries, nuts, and hidden energy into one of history's first real trail mixes. How native chefs made instant trail mix with dried berries and nuts is a perfect example of simple genius meeting real-world survival. Long before colorful packages lined grocery store shelves, Native American communities were gathering handfuls of nature's purest energy foods, drying them carefully under the sun, and combining them into powerful portable meals. Wild berries like chokecherry, elderberry, and wild strawberries were prized for their tartness and nutrition, while nuts like acorns, walnuts, and pine nuts packed a heavy punch of fat and protein. Some tribes even added roasted seeds, puffed grains, or strips of dried meat for extra stamina. The goal was not just taste, but endurance. It was survival in your pocket, designed by thousands of years of knowledge. And while they packed sweetness and strength into every bite, when it came to seasoning savory meals, native chefs turned to another source altogether: wild plants that turned every piece of meat into pure wilderness flavor. Spicing meat with wild juniper and sage instead of store-bought seasonings was a mark of true culinary craftsmanship long before organic became a buzzword. Juniper berries with their sharp piney taste and sage leaves with their deep, smoky aroma were easy to find across wide swaths of native lands, and together they created one of the oldest and most unforgettable flavor combinations known to man. Hunters would rub juniper directly onto fresh meat before roasting it over fires, allowing the resins to seep into the flesh and protect it from bacteria while infusing it with mouth-watering flavor. Sage was burned, brewed, and crushed into spice blends that transformed even the toughest game meats into savory, aromatic feasts. And just when you think seasoning meat could not get any more poetic, native chefs took it one step further, discovering a way to use wild berries not just as food, but as a way to glaze and preserve fish in the most mouth-watering way imaginable. Smoking fish with wild berries for a natural glaze was one of those strokes of genius that blended necessity and creativity in perfect balance. Freshly caught fish were rubbed or brushed with mashed wild berries like cranberries, chokecherries, or elderberries, then carefully smoked over low, aromatic fires. The natural sugars in the berries caramelized slowly in the smoke, forming a delicate, flavorful glaze that locked in moisture and added a subtle, tangy sweetness to every bite. It was preservation and flavor enhancement rolled into one breathtaking technique. The berry glaze also helped protect the fish from drying out too fast or attracting insects during the long smoking process. But the magic of earthborn cooking did not stop at meat. Deep underground and right in the fire itself, native chefs had another trick: roasting tough, stubborn root vegetables until they were sweet, tender, and full of hidden strength. Roasting root vegetables directly in campfire coals was one of the simplest yet most powerful cooking methods passed down through generations. Without ovens, pots, or fancy tools, native cooks understood that the earth's hidden foods, things like carrots, turnips, onions, and yams, could be transformed into sweet, hearty meals with nothing more than time and fire. Raw roots were buried in the hot, glowing coals of a dying fire, slowly roasting under layers of ash and heat. As they baked, their natural sugars caramelized, their fibers softened, and what once was hard and bitter became soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Pulling a roasted root from the coals was like uncovering buried treasure, the skin blackened and crisp, the inside steaming and tender. And speaking of patience, some of the sweetest flavors ever created by native chefs required even longer waits, like gathering and boiling maple sap into a clear, nourishing water that tasted like spring itself. Maple sap water, the original sweet cooking liquid, was one of nature's purest gifts and one that Native American communities mastered long before the first colonists ever set foot in North America. In early spring, when the nights were still cold but the days warmed just enough, sap would begin to flow through the veins of maple trees. Native foragers would tap these trees carefully, gathering the clear, slightly sweet liquid that poured out. It was not yet the thick, sticky syrup we think of today. Instead, it was a crisp, refreshing, faintly sweet water that could be drunk straight or used to cook rice, stew, or even brew lightweight, revitalizing teas. To drink maple sap water was to drink hope after a brutal winter. But as delicious as maple was, native chefs had another dark, overlooked ingredient that added both flavor and unexpected health benefits to their meals. And it came straight from the heart of the fire itself. Using charcoal powder to enhance meat flavor and aid digestion sounds almost too wild to be real, but for Native American cooks, it was a smart, practical tool built from hard-earned wisdom. After a fire burned down to pure white coals, small amounts of fine charcoal powder were sometimes sprinkled over cooking meats or even mixed into marinades. The charcoal acted as a natural purifier, absorbing toxins and helping break down tough fibers inside the meat, making it not only more flavorful but also easier on the stomach. Some healers even mixed tiny amounts into drinking water after big meals, trusting charcoal's natural ability to soothe digestion and guard against sickness. It tasted like the earth, the fire, and the sky, all wrapped up into one unforgettable bite. And if you thought using charcoal was clever, wait until you hear about how deer fat candles turned slow basting into an art form that even today's chefs can barely rival. Deer fat candles were one of the most imaginative and resourceful ways Native American cooks kept their meats tender and richly flavored over long, slow roasts. After rendering down the fat from deer or elk, they would form simple candles, which were set up to drip slowly over roasting meat on open spits or stone racks. As the fat melted, it would baste the meat continuously, keeping it moist, savory, and infused with a deep, wild flavor that no bottled sauce or glaze could ever match. This technique did not just make the food taste better, it helped preserve it longer, coating the meat with protective fat layers that held in moisture and kept bacteria at bay. But when it came to baking bread, native cooks had another kind of magic altogether, capturing the very air itself to make dough rise without a single packet of yeast. Trapping natural wild yeasts for bread making was a delicate dance between patience, instinct, and trust in nature. Long before modern yeast packets made baking effortless, native chefs understood how to harness the living cultures floating invisibly all around them. They would leave simple mixtures of ground corn, acorn flour, or other grains mixed with water exposed to the open air, letting wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria settle into the mix over several days. Every loaf was alive, shaped by the air, the season, and the land itself. Each region had its own distinct flavors, a fingerprint left by invisible forces. It was slow, careful baking rooted in the rhythms of the world, not the ticking of a kitchen timer. And if you thought that was incredible, imagine making an entire soup without a pot, without a bowl, just heated rocks, fresh herbs, and the oldest cooking trick you have never heard of. The lost trick of dry stone soup is one of the most breathtaking examples of cooking ingenuity hidden in history. In times when pots were scarce or broken, native chefs would still find ways to create nourishing, flavorful stews using nothing but fire-heated rocks and hand-picked herbs. Clean, flat stones were heated in a roaring fire until they almost glowed, then carefully transferred into woven bark baskets or hide-lined pits filled with water and raw ingredients. As the stones boiled the water, fresh roots, wild greens, dried meats, and foraged herbs were added, cooking into rich, smoky broths that filled the air with the scent of earth and flame. The rocks would be swapped out as they cooled, replaced again and again with fresh hot ones, keeping the liquid at a steady simmer. And when it came to sweet treats for the journey ahead, native chefs had one more marvel: crafting rich, chewy fruit leather with nothing but sunlight, fresh air, and the simplest tools imaginable. Making fruit leather with nothing but the sun and a flat rock was the perfect way to capture summer's sweetness for the long, hungry months ahead. Native American cooks would mash wild berries, apples, or plums into thick, pulpy pastes and spread them carefully over flat, sun-warmed stones. Covered lightly with woven grasses or bark to keep pests away, the fruit would dry slowly under the open sky, concentrating into chewy, intensely flavored strips packed with vitamins and natural sugars. These homemade fruit leathers were not just snacks. They were essential travel rations, dessert after lean meals, and precious gifts given between families and tribes. And while these sweet creations came from the land's generosity, another treasure was pulled from its hidden places too, one that changed cooking, trade, and survival forever: the gathering of salt from natural licks deep in the wild. Salt harvesting from natural licks and how it changed food forever is one of those hidden stories that shaped survival more than we realize. In a world without grocery stores or factories, finding salt meant everything. Native American communities knew where the land bled salt, places where groundwater left behind crystals, or wild animals led the way to salt licks hidden deep in forests and valleys. They would collect the precious mineral by hand, scraping or boiling it out of muddy springs, then carefully drying and storing it for trade, cooking, and medicine. Salt preserved meats, flavored stews, and replenished bodies worn down by long journeys or brutal seasons. It was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. But salt was not the only way native chefs elevated their meals. When it came to pure, haunting flavor, they had another secret weapon: the living aroma of the woods themselves turned into smoke and magic. Cooking over aromatic wood like cedar was not just about building a fire. It was about infusing every meal with a living, breathing memory of the forest. Cedar, mesquite, alder, and hickory were prized not only for their heat, but for their ability to lend food an unmistakable perfume: smoky, sweet, slightly bitter, and deeply grounding. Native chefs knew exactly which woods would turn a plain cut of fish or meat into something unforgettable. Fresh salmon might be roasted low over cedar planks, absorbing the wood's oils and scent, while rich game meats might get a kiss of mesquite's sharper bite. These woods were more than fuel. They were ingredients, carefully chosen like spices. And when it came to protecting meats from drying out or burning, native chefs did not just stop at wood. They found a way to wrap their food in the earth itself, locking in flavor with a method so smart it almost feels magical. Clay-coated meats were one of the most astonishing ways Native American cooks sealed in moisture, flavor, and nutrients without a single modern tool. Fresh game was coated in thick, wet clay, sometimes along with a layer of leaves or bark, then buried directly in hot coals or ash. As the clay baked hard around the meat, it formed a natural oven, trapping the juices inside and allowing the food to steam slowly in its own rich flavors. When the clay was finally cracked open, the aroma would hit you first: deep, smoky, and primal. It was cooking stripped down to its purest, most beautiful form. And even as the meat roasted and absorbed the earth's gifts, native chefs had another breathtaking trick: turning simple berry juice into smoking cloths that kissed their foods with a sweetness no store-bought glaze could ever match. Berry-stained smoking cloths were one of the most delicate and poetic techniques in Native American cooking, blending fire, fruit, and smoke into something unforgettable. Thin cloths, sometimes made from woven plant fibers or carefully prepared hides, were soaked in mashed wild berries like blueberries, strawberries, or elderberries. Once stained with the juice, these cloths were wrapped gently around fish, meat, or even roasted roots before being suspended over smoldering fires. As the smoke rose, the berry's natural sugars would slowly caramelize, seeping into the food and layering it with a faint sweetness that tasted like summer itself. And while berry cloths offered sweetness, there was another way native chefs added rich, subtle layers of flavor to every meal, by mastering the ancient art of infusing oils with the wild herbs that surrounded them. Infusing oils with wild herbs long before it became trendy was second nature to native cooks who understood that flavor did not come from stores, but from the living world around them. Fresh herbs like sweetgrass, wild mint, sage, and juniper were gathered and carefully steeped in animal fats or pressed plant oils, allowing their potent essences to slowly bloom and transform the base oils into something extraordinary. These infused oils were drizzled over roasted meats, stirred into thick stews, rubbed onto flatbreads, or even used for medicinal purposes. Every bottle or pouch of herb-infused oil was a time capsule of the land's abundance, a way to capture fleeting seasons and extend their gifts into the colder, harder months. Even today, chefs trying to recreate authentic indigenous flavors find themselves returning to these ancient, pure methods. And while infusing oils with herbs might sound refined and elegant, Native American cooking was never about luxury. It was about survival. See, in those times, people had mason jars with really airtight seals. These became essential for the produce and grocery of the time, which was always vegetables, jam, and jellies. Sometimes families, especially grandmothers, would use them for storing meat, and this symbolized how common canning became after the Great Depression and World War I. Preserving your harvest in a mason jar was about the best and smartest thing you could do for extending its shelf life by a good margin. A fun thing they used to do was water baths and pressure canning in mason jars, which was a big habit amongst gardeners and home chefs. Cooking with canning jars is one of the most common things to do because they're built to do really well around high temperatures. People use it during sous vide, or to bake, or even when they're slow cooking. These jars are airtight, and their heat resistance really isn't a joke. You should look up how good tempered glass is when it comes to dealing with extreme heat, because it's literally the entire point of picking it out for the canning jars. The jars are usually heated to really high temperatures so that the food inside can be sterilized and preserved, and the glass actually expands and then contracts back to its original size and shape without breaking. This means you can place it on any source of heat, a stove, an oven, or even a pot of boiling hot water, and not worry about any glass exploding in your kitchen. If you cook with canning jars, then the context of slow cooking really is the best one to use them in. The airtight seal really helps to trap moisture in, which helps to boost the flavor of something by several levels. You also get some pretty even cooking since what you're cooking in doesn't have a lot of space, though that comes with some side effects like managing your portion or needing to cook a few more times than normal. Still, I bet you didn't know we could cook with canning jars, did you? Before the days of freezers and two-door fridges, we had cold cellars, which you may also have heard being referred to as root cellars. For centuries, this was pretty much the cornerstone of not just America, but global society as a whole on how to preserve their food. Why was that, though? Most modern freezers actually try to replicate the environments people had in cold cellars. The temperatures you'd find in these frosty rooms would go down to 30 degrees and 50 degrees, and that meant that enzymatic activity, the same thing we just discussed that browns your bananas bad, goes down heavily in vegetables and fruits. Cold temperatures basically do the same for microbes too. Stunted growth is bad for anyone, not just kids that don't drink their milk. Plus, cold cellars have really high levels of humidity. Moisture retention is a big deal for these things, you know. You don't give them enough of that, they're liable to die way before they need to. Yet you've also heard that too much of the stuff is bad for you. You've probably heard your parents say not to keep your apples too close or around too much air, or keep your onions separate. Well, that's because of ethylene gas. With too much moisture and not enough ventilation, the buildup of this glass and the release of it causes a lot of nasty cross-contamination. Basically, you don't want your fruits being bad neighbors, and cold cellars were such a nice neighborhood too. Crockpots were more or less the slow cookers of the past century, and they were extremely trendy in the 1970s and 1980s. You could pin their skyrocketing popularity on a lot of things, but most of it was that they aligned with the food norms of the time. Slow-cooked roasts and the like were becoming a daily aspect of people's meals once again, and besides that, people wanted to step away from hard and complicated cooking that required you to dedicate a lot of time to being in the kitchen and observing every little thing. Crockpots let you do that by just setting whatever you had on the stove and forgetting about it for a while as it slowly cooked, so you could tend to other work, chores, or just some much-needed relaxation time without any worries. One-pot meals also were some of the most widely consumed things people had, with stuff like casseroles and soups being a typical American lunch back then. Also, people really appreciated what it did for the flavor. The United States is largely a meat-eating country, and slow cooking really enriches the flavor of anything you are working with. So, storing lettuce in damp cloths follows pretty much the exact same principles we went over while we were discussing how bread can help you get your sugar back. It's all about moisture retention, but this time around it's also got a lot to do with regulating the temperature of the lettuce. This really helps maintain the vegetable, because lettuce usually contains a lot of water, and that makes it easily perishable. Bummer, right? Especially when we use it in so many things, which always prompts you to buy in bulk. But that may not be the right idea, since you end up with wilted and dried lettuce, and no one wants that, right? Putting a damp cloth on it helps keep it humid, which means that the lettuce gets a perpetual source of moisture. This helps to keep the moisture in for long, and the cloth itself helps to absorb moisture coming in from the air and helps buffer the temperature too. You get a consistent humidity this way and some airflow since it is a cloth. All of this works really well by giving lettuce essentially the perfect environment it needs to last longer. So no one's a stranger to the process of larding, but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook, but when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. Candy dishes would usually always be filled to the brim with wrapped sweets, especially if we are discussing the holiday season. As soon as you had October roll around, people would start preemptively planning their best Halloween ideas and what candies they were going to get to fill up the dishes this year. Many even had really decorative designs to them, like colorful or cut glass and spooky patterning. It was all a part of setting up the vibe of your home back in the day. Going out shopping for new and in-style candy dishes is a thing of the past now. But when people engaged in this activity, it was a bonding event for families. So was emptying those dishes every week, by the way. Okay, so you don't have any string to slice your cake with, and your knife just isn't sharp enough to make the cut, literally. What do? Would you believe me if I said that soap bars actually help sharpen your knives? While they'll never help do the job as well as a sharpening rod or some kind of whetstone, they can work as a last resort in a tricky situation where you really need just a bit more of an edge. Again, literally. The reason soap bars are so good for this is because of a combination of a few things we've discussed so far in the video and a few things that we haven't. So, basically, soap bars are lubricating, and you all know that. The soap helps cool down the blade by reducing the overall friction, and while you'd think this is counterproductive to sharpening, it really just means that smoother sharpening can happen since the blade doesn't overheat. This helps preserve the overall standard of your steel. So, soap isn't really that abrasive, but it is slightly abrasive, and this helps sharpen the blade just a little bit thanks to the really gritty particles you find in most bars. It also helps clean the knife, obviously, and that can really help restore some of the edge of the blade. While I bet you had no idea any of this was possible, now you know soap bars are officially in your list of things that help keep that knife cutting edge. Okay, I'm sorry, that's the last one. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrates break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. Vintage Tupperware was particularly popular in the 1950s and 1960s, and it was known for 3 things. It was practical, so you could get a lot of use out of it. The designs were fresh, new, and very chic, and they had a sense of style and identity with their use of bright colors. Palettes like mint green and pink were common in the 50s, and most Tupperware also came in stronger, warmer colors like mustard yellow, turquoise, and orange. This led to households always having the chance to design their kitchen and eating space however they wanted, down to the forks, spoons, and bowls, and there was just a lot more variety than you would find today. If somebody said they were bringing out the fancy stuff, you could always be sure you would get some pretty-looking cutlery. We are quite sure that this is a universal human experience that everyone has gone through at this point, whatever corner of the planet you may be from. Sometimes you have to sew something yourself. You ask your mom where the supplies are, she points you to your grandmother, who enthusiastically pulls out a biscuit tin or container of sweets. Maybe you get a little excited and jumpy, as naturally everyone would at the sight of a free sugar rush, but when she pops the lid open, all you see are sewing supplies. Did you ever wonder why they did this? Baking soda is a renowned cleaner across the globe. Got cat piss on your bedsheet? Somebody puked because they couldn't handle their liquor? Just a bad day? Or was that burger not fresh enough? Whatever your stink-radiating issue is, baking soda is there to clean it, but why is it such a universal cleaner? I mean, what singles this one thing out as a cleaner that works in every situation when everything else has designated specialized things specifically built to clean it? This is because baking soda has all the properties you would need in a cleaner. It's only just slightly abrasive, and as we discussed with salt, that really helps in removing unwanted surfaces without causing any kind of bad damage. So that means all of your dirt, any unwanted stains, or just plain old grease buildup are all things baking soda excels at taking care of. The particles of soda are also pretty similar to salt in that they're also very coarse, and this helps clean grime too. Baking soda on top of this is ever so slightly alkaline too. It has a pH of around 9, and most common stains and issues you'll find in homes are pretty acidic. Things like baking soda help neutralize that by breaking down the oils in them, and that helps keep the stains away. It also helps take away the odors from any kind of spoiled food or excess waste too. Again, this is because these odors happen as a result of acid, and as we now know, baking soda is pretty good at canceling that out. So if you ever wanted to see an actual jack of all trades, here you go. So I'm sure you've seen this in movies before, but clay pot cooling was a real thing. It's a pretty vintage cooling technique, but it just takes some smart advantage of the properties of clay. Since clay happens to be a material with more pores than it knows what to do with, water tends to reach the outer surface easily enough. Imagine really tiny channels of water that give a very slow but steady supply of water to the inside surface. Since the water is ultimately so little, though, it tends to evaporate and create an environment where it absorbs heat and turns to a vapor, something you may or may not know as the endothermic process. This evaporation is pretty much what creates a lower temperature and humidity inside the pot and helps create that natural refrigerator effect that made this such a genius way of preserving everything and anything all inside an easily transportable and carryable pot. This is still an active tradition in many parts of the world, but in America, historically, settlers used pots to keep waters and fruits cold and fresh before ice boxes were ever a thing. Percolator coffee pots were what people used to make their dearly beloved coffee before the age of drip coffee makers in the 20th century. This is how you would make some strong coffee, and it was done by cycling boiling water through grounded coffee. It used a basket and a tube to do those, and they became known for three things: being very straightforward to use and brewing incredibly vibrant and strong coffee. They have been replaced by single-serve Keurig machines and espresso makers because you just get more control over what kind of coffee you want to make with them. But to get that old-fashioned coffee, some households do still enjoy a percolator. Storing herbs in an ice cube tray works incredibly well because it really helps to keep them fresh, at least as fresh as they really can be. The herbs are very fragile, and if you've spent a lot of time seasoning your food, this isn't something I need to tell you. The essential oils in these are pretty much non-existent the moment they come into contact with air, and that only starts becoming more of a problem the longer that exposure lasts. They don't do well with lighter heat either, which is why an ice cube tray works for three reasons. 1, it helps preserve their freshness. Okay, tell me why, right? Well, ice cube trays put a little roadblock in a neat and slightly annoying process I affectionately call oxidation, and that really helps to keep spoilage issues low. That's all thanks to the cold temperature helping the enzymes stay away from the tissues of the herbs, and in turn, the oils that are with them. 2, there's only so much space in a tray, so you only take out the amount of herbs you need, which helps you keep spoilage to a low anyway. 3rd, you always place these trays in freezers, away from any kind of light or heat, which gives the herbs the perfect environment they need to rest and chill until you need to take them out. Ice houses were a pretty integral part of how food preservation worked for the better part of several centuries. Before we had the dawn of mechanical refrigeration, this was pretty much the standard way of how to do things. There were a few reasons too, because the icehouse format had been reformed and refined until they hit a blueprint that ticked every box. The icehouses we've come to see having widespread use were built underground, with really thick walls that were reinforced with layers of stones and bricks, sometimes even wood. They'd also be layered with things like straw, sawdust, or peat moss, so that they'd be covered with insulators. The idea was to stop heat transferring, you know? Insulation helps keep thermal conductivity low, so heat doesn't really get the chance to creep into the house. Plus, while nobody ever expected these ice houses to last forever, they had one benefit over fridges, kind of. If the power goes out, you're on a countdown until it comes back or your stuff spoils. In an ice house, thanks to a concept known as latent heat of fusion, ice houses would stay cool on the inside as the exterior would melt. This is because ice absorbs a large amount of heat while it melts. All of this, combined with the ventilation that would be built into these, would basically ensure that ice houses were as close to fridges as people were going to get for a long time. The pressure cooker was first invented in the 17th century, but most people began associating it with the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when stews became extremely common. Commercial mass production of pressure cookers began around this time, with the first one, the MBG, made in a Chicago factory in 1930. Due to high demand from home chefs, including stay-at-home wives and grandmothers, these cookers quickly gained popularity in the market. You could reduce cooking time with them, and they used a lot less energy than most conventional methods. As a result, people really took to these neat little things. One of the best parts was that it retained two of the most important things about your food better than anything else, which was the flavor and the nutrients. Pressure cooking helped keep more nutrients in your food as it used less water overall, and the tightly sealed environment helped keep evaporation on the down low, and it was really good for handling tough cuts of meat. Vinegar Acidic. And that's not new information. Hell, even a fifth grader these days can tell you that. At least I hope they can. Anyway, don't worry, because I'm here to tell you all about why its acidity is a factor we want to really be appreciating with this hack. See, that acidic nature helps to loosen and dissolve the burnt surface that you see on pans, the icky black stuff that sticks and just won't go away. Acetic acid is actually pretty weak, and vinegar doesn't exactly have the highest concentration of it, but its reaction with the minerals you'd find in burnt food and grease is what's interesting here. The acid actually helps break these down through an acid-base reaction and dissolution. Now those sound like fancy science words, but it basically means that this stuff is really good at helping the burnt food or grease detach from the surface of the pan. It's because vinegar is really good at cutting through stuff like that, which helps it dissolve greasy substances. I guess you can salvage that pan after all, right? Again, with wax sealing jars, the same thing holds true. An age-old concept that was actually far ahead of its time. It's all just a pretty clever use of the natural properties of these things, really. Wax forms a barrier between air and your food, and that means you don't have to worry about any airborne contamination or any bacteria getting the air they need to survive. Plus, what a lot of people would do is melt the wax and pour it over the food. Cold isn't the only thing you can trap inside things like ice houses. You can do the same to heat in things like melted wax. Not only would this sterilize the wax, it would kill off most bacteria on the surface of the jar too. There were loads of cultural traditions around farm families that basically let them use wax jars as much as they could, alongside a strong artistic appeal. Some people would use specialty wax jars for high-quality jams, honey, or other kinds of gourmet products. In the 70s, there was kind of a return for things like this, but they couldn't keep up with modern technology, so they eventually were left behind once again. The meat grinders of yesterday were known as manual food mincers, and before electrical appliances and pre-packaged processed meat took over marts and homes alike, they were a kitchen staple you would find everywhere. Manual food mincers let any kind of family enjoy most kinds of food, like meat, veggies, and dry nuts as well. You could have ground meat or minced, which let them make sausages and burgers, steaks, or pâtés. So you could open up access to dumplings for dinner or a cookout with homemade burgers. A lot of meat stuffing dishes like meatloafs and dumplings were also very popular things to make, so food mincers helped in preparing those, and they were very self-sufficient and economical. So this one might really be a wonder for you, but it actually does work, both in theory and execution. Using bread to revive hardened sugar is a classic kitchen hack that basically just plays around a little bit with science to get some much-needed utility in the kitchen. So, people weren't just using sugar, they had substituted it with brown sugar, and that really was prone to hardening a lot. It wasn't good at keeping its moisture, especially since brown sugar had a decent amount of molasses. Those had water content, but it would pretty much evaporate and cause the bits of sugar to lump together. Now, the issue here seems to be that we don't have enough water to keep things going around here, right? Bread, conveniently enough, has an incredible amount of water content. The moisture in bread is around 35 to 45%, and when you put that up against hardened sugar, the difference comparatively is immense. The process by which you take advantage of all this is called diffusion. It helps water molecules move from a densely packed surface like the bread to a place that's missing water. Think of it like a revive in a Call of Duty game. Once you put that bread in an airtight container with the sugar, the vapor the bread gives off naturally starts diffusing into the sugar, and that in turn softens. Pretty neat, right? Looks like we're going to be dealing with some millennia-old classics for a while. Sprouting grains is probably older than the last two combined, and it basically works as a steroid for your grains. You soak, germinate, and sprout the grains, and this does a lot for them. It activates enzymes like amylase and protease, and then they break down complex carbs, fats, and proteins. Not sure what all that means? Basically, you turn on the things that help break your food down and turn it a lot more digestible. Naturally, germination also has been known to make the vitamins that are already there in fruits even more effective. Vitamins B and C get the highest effect out of this, though the science on that one is lost to me too. Not only was sprouting grains a big idea during colonial America, but it was something that became a mainstream practice during the Great Depression and War era thanks to the way people were sharing any and all information, including long-held family traditions just to survive another day and keep their pantry going. Ice water to peel eggs is really common, and I'm sure it's something you've heard of before too. See, the boiling of an egg does two things to the egg. One, the protein inside the whites and the yolks comes together and really solidifies. Pretty convenient for eating purposes, but not so much for peeling ones. The heat is what makes the egg expand after all, but it also kind of means the shell sticks to the egg now. When you take that egg that was just drenched in hot water and instead put it in some ice-cold water, you create a cool little thing known as thermal shock. Have you ever been taking a really hot shower and then taken a really cold one, only to find your muscles cramping up? Yeah, that's the same concept here. The cold makes the egg contract, and pretty badly at that. It can be a pretty big pain waiting to peel all your eggs after you just waited a decent bit to boil all of them, so next time, save yourself some time, do everyone a favor and just pour some really cold water in a glass or bowl. Grandmas would often have handwritten recipe cards that they would keep passing down through the family, because these were a way to preserve recipes so that even their kids' grandkids could enjoy the delicious things they would whip up. Recipe cards would often be found in binders or small containers, and it was not like a strict step-by-step cooking guide, but a loving tutorial on how to make the most famous recipes Grandma would cook up. This includes Thanksgiving specials, Christmas delights, and Halloween sweets and treats. As you can probably tell, these were keepsakes for a lot of families and still hold a lot of sentimental value. Sprinkling flour on any kind of surface always helps with any kind of non-stick rolling. This is again another case of something being a natural barrier. The little barrier that sprinkling flour provides between the rolling pin and the surface of the dough does two important things for it. One, you reduce the overall friction, and two, you prevent the dough from sticking. Now, why does that happen? Well, dough, again, is made out of a lot of water, and that means it tends to become sticky when it gets rolled out. Flour, on the other hand, is really good at absorbing moisture. See, a lot of this is just pairing one thing up with something that's the opposite of what it is so that you can balance the side effects of using it. You use non-stick rolling for your dough, which naturally means you run into moisture issues. You use flour, which is really good at taking away moisture, with your dough that's producing too much. That barrier also works as a little powdery layer between the surface and the dough, and this really helps the dough not stick to the pan. You've heard this one 1,000 times before, and for good reason too. People dry their herbs because it's simply one of the best, oldest, and most effective ways of removing any excess moisture, keeping all that icky, bacterial nonsense off of your herbs, and making sure that your greens last as long as you need them to. You're here for the why, though, and that's what I'm here to answer for you. When you dry herbs, you reduce their overall water content. As we've discussed already, a bunch of harmful bacteria and microorganisms desperately need water and air to survive, and in that regard, they're really not so different from us. Volatile oils, on the other hand, are what give herbs and aromatics their flavor and scents. This is why you've probably heard folk tips such as boiling herbs to clear out odors. High temperatures cause these essentials to leak out, so the opposite, which in this case is proper drying, actually helps maintain these oils in the herbs, sealing all that flavor and fragrance in. In Native American traditions, their herbalists used to dry herbs to ensure that treatments, ointments, medicinal balms, and herb-based remedies were available to the community all year round. Yarrow and chamomile, for example, were and still are big-time staples of household remedies. During World War II, these practices were adopted by the mainstream to help victory gardens provide more produce that would last longer as well. So, it might be a basic trick, but it's got a lot of benefits and history behind it. Nowadays, we just do not get cookie jars anymore. It is not like most households do not use them, but, in the past it was a lot more common for people to walk in, see a glass of milk next to a ceramic cookie jar, and then proceed to have an overly sweet and good time. Today, you cannot get that experience because everything comes pre-packaged and made for commercial mass production and sale, focusing on resealable containers that people do not need storage for in other ways. Today, the typical family focuses a lot on being minimal or having glass containers which are better at storing things than cookie jars, but the aesthetic of them was really nice. If these timeless traditions stirred something inside you, share your favorite forgotten trick in the comments and help keep the old ways alive by liking the video and subscribing for more journeys back to what really matters.